I'm here today with Vernadette Broyles, and she is an attorney and has been dealing with some incredibly interesting cases, very disturbing cases. And Vernadette, do you just want to go ahead and start talking about the case that you have now? I believe it's in Florida with a girl who was sexually assaulted by a gender nonconforming boy who was allowed in the restroom with her.
Sure, it's actually in Georgia, of all
Okay.
places. I wouldn't have thought of Georgia as a location for this sort of thing, but yes, it's in a very progressive town called Decatur, right outside of Atlanta. And I first got involved with the case when I was contacted by parents who discovered a secret privacy facility policy that the superintendent had put into place. He did not make it public. It didn't go through the normal channels of public notice and discussion in the school board. He had secret email conversations with the board saying, this is what I want, this is a policy I want to do. I basically want to let children use the bathrooms that they self-identify with. And is this okay with you? They agreed with it, and he went forward with this secret policy it was like a policy directive he gave to all of the staff throughout the school district. It wasn't until February of 2017 that a parent accidentally discovered this because the superintendent had posted it on a Facebook page and realized this is what's going on in our schools. So these parents became very concerned, but they had a daughter in the school system, and they reached out for lawyers, and I responded. So we began to get involved with parents locally there. Interestingly enough, most of which were African American. And the part of they were troubled by the superintendent was analogizing gender confusion with being Black. And they found that extremely offensive, very offensive. So in any case, we were attempting to converse with him, had meetings, and then showed up in school board meetings and made it a public issue. Well, there was one particular school board meeting that they finally realized they had to discuss this publicly. And there was a huge turnout, huge packed out turnout. And a number of parents, there were obviously many supporters, but there were also other parents that expressed concerns that this is going to put our children at risk. This is going to violate their safety, their privacy, especially the girls. And one gentleman an attorney, had been the chairman of the Pardons and Parole Boards for Georgia, said, mark my words, this is going to open up privacy spaces to young boys to have access to girls for mischievous purposes. And he got booed and laughed at. Literally 1 month later, my client's daughter, who was then in kindergarten, was sexually assaulted in the bathroom of her kindergarten. She had asked to go to the bathroom. The little boy asked to go at the same time. They were allowed to go at the same time, these two kids by themselves, no adult supervision. And pursuant to this policy, he had access to go. Apparently, we had learned that he had been gender fluid. He would come dressed as a girl one day, went dressed as a boy other days. So there was a gender fluidity about this child. And so he followed her into the school bathroom. As she was coming out of the stall, he pinned her up against the wall. He had extended his finger, and then he pushed her up against the wall and attempted to penetrate her with his finger through her leggings, the little soft leggings. And according to her, he actually did penetrate it. She struggled. She told him to stop. I mean, this was not a passing thing. It hurt. And then finally, I guess she was able to push him, away or whatever, and the two went back into class. A few days later, she's complaining of pain in her privates. They're in bed with her mom, and her mom's like, what's going on? So she tells her mom what happened. Her mom immediately the next day goes to school and tells the school. So Aaron, it's bad enough, it truly is bad enough that the school had this policy. And by the way, at this point, it still hadn't been made public. If you went to the school district meeting, you knew about it, but they never formally adopted the policy and made it part of the handbook or student handbook or anything public. So if you weren't somehow in the know, you still didn't know about this, that your child could be, you know, changing or in a bathroom with someone of the opposite sex. And of course, we know that for girls, let's just be realistic. Too many of us have been attacked in these situations. So in any case, mom didn't even know about this policy. She wasn't in any way plugged in. And so when she went to report this, the way in which she was treated, initially it was kind of just shock, and they sent her, they, you know, encouraged her to go to the hospital. And she did. So immediately had the daughter examined. But from that point on, the way in which she was treated was absolutely shameful. And I'll stop there if you have questions, or I can continue telling the story if you like.
One of the things that I just wanted to clarify is that apparently they had informed this gender nonconforming boy that he could use whichever restroom he wanted to. So they must have been sharing that information with some of the parents about their child's ability to self-select a bathroom. And one of the things that I really want to clarify is that a lot of people are they want to be very sympathetic towards what they consider transgender kids. But it sounds like this policy would allow any child to self-ID and choose whichever bathroom they wanted, regardless of any issues with gender dysphoria or gender nonconformity in the past, that basically it just allows a child to pick which bathroom to go into. Is that correct?
That is correct. This policy was the most wide open policy that you could possibly imagine. It did not require any sort of medical interventions to begin any sort of transitions in the student. It didn't require any changing of your legal documentation. It's basically whatever a child subjectively identified themselves to be. The presumption is you don't question the child, okay, regardless of biological reality. And so they were supposed to be allowed. We really don't yet know, because we're going to begin to go into discovery. Precisely what was told to some of the parents. We knew that there was a lot of interaction with trans activists in the school, whereas it was like pulling teeth to get leadership to meet with just, you know, rank and file parents, or parents that had concerns. Apparently there was a lot of interaction with trans activists. So, but in any case, what we do know is that this policy was in place, and so this boy would have been allowed, he would not have been disallowed to be in there if a teacher observed that he was going in there. So,
and this is one of the things that really concerns me, is this kind of inversion of authority that I see happening again and again, where children are allowed to dictate things to adults in a way that really it's not reasonable to expect children to have that kind of power. Is that something that you're seeing?
You know, you really touched on something that is extremely disturbing to me. I had practiced family law for 13 years, and about 11 of those years I was a guardian ad litem for children. So I represented children in the midst of difficult custody disputes. And what you just said is perhaps one of the most disturbing things that I'm seeing in all of this. I had a judge tell me, I had a terrible parental alienation case one time where the judge finally looked at the alienating parent, and actually was a stepmother, and said, basically, you have given the keys to the family car to a child. And this child is driving the entire family over the cliff because she's just a child. And so at that point, he changed custody, and he placed her with mom. And you know what? And she turned out to be just fine. She ended up being fine because the adults in the room finally said, we're the adults in the room, you're a child. And this is what is best and right for you. And this is what you need to do. And it wasn't but a few months before she realized, okay, this is how it is. And she reconnected with them. So going back to what you're saying is that I feel like not only it is tremendously harmful and inappropriate for the adults to abdicate their responsibility to provide the guidance, the boundaries and the guidance and the reality check and the training that they need to children, because children come into the world tabula rasa. They're a blank slate. They don't know what the word for boy or girl is. It could be one of 1,000 words depending upon your language. When I was growing up, the word for girl was niña because I spoke Espanol, right? So it all depends on what you're training the child to believe is reality, because they don't know any better. They believe the adults in their world. And so adults really have got to stop this, it's this empowering a child to basically harm themselves and harm the entire family dynamic.
The other question that I have for you is about the impact of this on the little girl who was assaulted. And what kind of a message does it give her to know that the adults are not going to be protecting her?
You know, that's just one of the many things that's so tragic about this situation is to kind of go through more with the story. So mom takes the little girl to the hospital and has her examined. And unbeknownst to her, the school calls the Department of Family and Children's Services on mom. Now, they made a report regarding the little boy, which is appropriate, because when you have a 5-year-old boy that's behaving in this sort of sexually aggressive way, there is legitimate reason to be wondering what's going on in the home life. So that was an appropriate referral, which, by the way, the school gave his parents the courtesy of letting them know that they called DFACS. But mom, there was no legitimate reason to call about mom, because this happened at school. How can mom be possibly responsible? So in any case, that we felt that was part of, that was an effort at intimidation and retaliation. And then when she comes, now this is over the Thanksgiving break. So when no one checks on her, the principal, the assistant principal, don't call to check on this child, check on this family, talk with mom, investigate what happens, bring her in for a meeting. Okay. So when she comes in, oh, by the way, there was a police officer involved, but they immediately decided not to prosecute because the boy was too young, which makes sense. So they didn't investigate. And so now school comes back, mom is trying to call the principal to schedule a meeting to talk about how you're going to safeguard my daughter. She can't get return calls. It's not until she threatens to go to the media, the news media, that she gets a return call. Okay.
I'm hearing this and it's astonishing. It's horrifying to me. I mean, I just can't imagine how that mother and her little girl must have felt through all this, talk about victim blaming. And I mean, this is just horrifying. And I suspect that this isn't the only case. This is just the only one that we happen to know about right now.
You know, and that's one of the things that I'm glad we're doing this, is because I find myself wondering, you know, it just so happened that we found out about mom because we were very active in what was going on in this community. And I can't tell you how we found out, but it's really extraordinary that we found out about it. How many other places, how many of the schools is there are their children being in some way inappropriately tested? We did find out as a result of an investigation by the Office for Civil Rights. Let me back up. Once I got involved, we submitted a complaint to the Office for Civil Rights for the United States Department of Education. They conducted a 21-month-long investigation and found that the school district had violated Title IX. Okay. In the midst of that, we found out that this little boy had been in the school bathroom before, and he had actually been accosted, sexually assaulted himself, it looks like. Okay. So how many other, and one of the shortfalls and reprimands that the OCR gave to the school district is the way that the school district implemented this policy in light of the known sexual harassment that happens on school grounds, and particularly in isolated places, in bathrooms, and the lack of safeguards and the implementation. So I really do hope that others are hearing this, and parents would come forth and let it be known that something has happened in the bathroom with their child, particularly if a school policy has opened the door to students of the opposite sex accessing their child, and now has left their child vulnerable to being assaulted. This needs to be known so that policies are
Yeah, and one of the
appropriate.
things that really disturbs me is that I know in a lot of school districts now that men who claim to believe that they feel like they're women are allowed to access the girls and the women's facilities and be the supervisor of girls when they're in locker rooms or in bathrooms. And I can't think of a situation that is more problematic, because all it takes is for a predator to say they identify as a woman and they have access to little girls in situations where they're very vulnerable.
These policies have two fundamental problems on two different sides. You know, I work with I am a feminist, and I work with Kaya feminists, they're our colleagues, and the way that this is placing girls and women in a vulnerable situation when we're isolated, we're taking care of bodily needs, we're attending to, you know, our clothing, or we're undressed or partially undressed. It is putting us at risk in a time when sexual harassment is an all-time high. And you would have thought that the Me Too movement would have shut this down, but unfortunately, women are being shut down instead. I myself am a survivor, so it was part of my passion in all of this is that I want to be a voice for girls to be able to say no. I want to have my own space. I want to have a space with other, people who are females like me, have the same body parts, but like me. And it should be okay for me to object when someone who doesn't have my same body parts wants to invade my space. We need to have that right.
Well, and you mentioned the Me Too movement, and one of the things that I see this undermining is girls' ability to consent. If they're told from the time they're in kindergarten that they don't have a right to determine whether or not a male views them in compromising situations in states of undress, as you mentioned, if they complain about that now, they're labeled as transphobic.
Right.
If a grown woman like me goes into the gym and there is a male body with a penis next to me in the locker room, and I complain, I am the one who's likely to lose my membership. I am the one who's going to be labeled as transphobic. And as you said, for survivors, and we're both survivors,
Mm.
I feel very strongly that I have the right not to have male body parts in locker rooms where I'm vulnerable. And that kind of reminds me of something that you said, that trans activists are comparing this to the civil rights movement. And I wondered if you could speak on that, because I have very strong feelings about how this is radically different. That in the case of the civil rights movement, we had Black Americans who were saying, we want access to the same facilities as white people. In this case, we have women who are saying, we are vulnerable, and it is what we're asking is for us to have our rights respected over men's feelings. But I wondered if you had more of a nuanced perspective on this.
I do. I'm a Puerto Rican lineage, full-blooded. And so I'm actually triracial. Part of me is African, part of me is white, and part of me is native. Um, it's very, this is a completely false analogy. And it frankly it's a rather insulting one. There is no comparison when you're talking about differences in skin color. There's no legitimate legal reason to keep a person of a different skin color out of the same bathroom. There's no reason to separate whites from blacks from brown people like me in bathrooms. There's no physiological reason. There's no appropriate legal reason to treat people differently based on merely skin color. That's a superficial physical characteristic that has nothing to do with with using bathrooms. When you're talking about male versus female, there are vast differences. I've talked to several doctors. The genetic differences between male and females, there's hundreds of different genes that separate. There's physiological significant differences. And when it comes to the bathroom, the whole reason you have sex separated bathrooms is we have different excretory body parts. Bottom line, that's the only reason for it. And so it make, men are exposed if when they go to the bathroom. And the second reason is that they're isolated places. And so a woman, generally speaking, is vulnerable to men. I was a former prosecutor. 90% of cases of sexual assault or assault are males against females. It's just the reality in which we live. And so you put women who are physically vulnerable in isolated places with a male. It doesn't matter what he subjectively calls himself. It's a completely false analogy. And I really feel that they are using people of color, of which I am one. I resent being used in that way. My struggles have nothing to do with keeping males appropriately separate from females in certain privacy settings.
Well, and it is really interesting to me that there's sort of this strange reality that a male can claim to be a woman, and we have to accept that. But if I were to claim to be Black, brown, Native American, it would be very offensive. And rightly so. That's not my cultural background. That's not my heritage. But for some reason, it's okay for them to appropriate womanhood, but we're not allowed to appropriate, other aspects of culture. And again, appropriately so. And the other thing that I find ironic is that, like you said, sex is something that's in every cell of our body. It's very
Yes.
discernible. It's empirical. We know it. We can test it. We know exactly whether someone's male or female. Whereas race is definitely, I wouldn't know looking at you what your racial heritage was if you didn't tell me. And so to compare those two is just, I think, really disingenuous. And it's almost like inverted that, we should be talking about race as a spectrum and gender as a binary, or sex as a binary, but instead we're doing the other way around. And I'm not sure why it is that the left has decided to adopt this kind of worldview, but it makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, I think that they're seeking to ground what they're doing, particularly with children, in a veneer of legitimacy, by in some way analogizing it or connecting it to the historic civil rights struggle, which is a noble struggle, an absolutely noble struggle.
Definitely.
But from my perspective, in which I focus on children and I focus on families and parental rights and children, what I really believe is happening is that they are weaponizing children's susceptibility, their suggestibility, the fact that they are vulnerable, they lack life experience to know when they're being lied to, they trust adults around them. They, of course, trust adults, particularly when they have credentials. And they're weaponizing the natural instability that is a part of every child's life. Children inherently go through stages of instability as they transition from one to the other and grow and develop, but they're weaponizing that. And I believe that first of all, they're doing children tremendous harm. And I believe that they're doing it in order to be able to, it has the veneer of empowering children, but really what's happening is that they're trying to strip parents away. They're trying to strip the authority that parents have to be able to guard their children and to guide their children into healthy adulthood, so that they can hold sway over children. So I'll bring it back to my case. The second part of this policy that was troubling to us is how this has a way of normalizing to children by virtue of bathroom policies, the idea of gender ideology. Okay. And we see that it harmed a little girl, but it also, I believe, it's harming this little boy. I feel like he's a victim as well.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just so frustrating to me, because on so many levels, it's about gaslighting. It's about really undermining children's ability to understand reality. And like you said, it's our adults' job is to help children to define reality. And what this whole movement is doing is undermining a child's ability to even know what reality is. So we're going to grow up with a whole generation of kids who really have no foundations for their reality and think that their feelings dictate reality, which is a really scary proposition.
Yeah, it really is. So, you know what, I'd love to talk with you, Erin, and use the balance of our time to talk about where we're making inroads and solutions and empowering of parents, because you know I inherently reject the notion that this is just how things are, just you know how they are, and there's nothing we can do, and we're just going to basically lose a generation. My, the way I feel about it is, so long as there is breath in our lungs, life in our body, there's something we can do about it. And you know, even if we go down in flames, there's something that we can do about this, because we're talking about protecting our next generation.
Well, and I really think that's important because I hear people talk about this, but it's like they just sort of talk about it, and we need to really, this is a call to action.
It is.
We need people to
It is.
stop just sitting around. We need to empower them and tell them, we need to demand that people stand up and protect our kids.
Right. So, you know, I'll kind of launch into that, Erin, and then you can chime in or ask different questions. But with regards to parents, my first thing, it really does start there. And number one, parents need to become parents again. All right. No longer be your child's best friend. Monitor, either, frankly, turn off social media. At this point, you know, the internet has become, it's it's almost like what a highway would be to a 4-year-old. I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to let your kid just walk out there. At this point, there are things that will grab hold of your children and drag them to death or run them over on the internet right now. And you know that. I mean, when you see these teenagers coming, you know, latching on to these identities and completely turning the world upside down, it's most oftentimes is coming through the internet. So I would say just shut that darn thing down. And if it has to be used for school, be around, number one. Number two, parents, know what's going on at school. I mean, get yourself involved in school. The reason we found out what was happening in this school in Decatur was because we had a parent that was poking around and checking things out with regards to the school, and came across this and got involved. You know, as a parent, and I am, know what they're teaching your children in the classroom. Talk to your child. Find out exactly what are they teaching. Look at their syllabus. You know, meet with the teachers and basically let them know you're going to be involved. Because one of the things that we're seeing is that teachers, and there are activists are teaching teachers, and the teachers unions are on board with this, to find ways to get around parents, to not let parents know that they are treating their child one way at school, but if the parents are around, then they'll say something different. Okay. Or they're affirming this child in a completely, you know, new identity, almost having, you know, a dual life, which is so harmful to a child. Oh my God, how harmful that is. And conspiring to keep it away from parents. So, but you know, the parent that is engaged and involved, and the teacher knows that, they're gonna think twice.
Where do you think this whole mentality from the schools came that parents are almost the enemy? I mean, I really get that impression. Even, when the schools shut down for COVID, I can't tell you how many stories I heard about how horrible this was going to be for children because they were going to be stuck at home with their parents. And I'm like, wow, we now have schools that are upset because children are now spending time with their parents.
Well, strangely enough, I think COVID was actually a blessing in disguise.
I,
I
I
think
would
a lot
agree
of
because
children got a chance to detox
Mhm.
from what was going on in their school and the things that they're being exposed to at school. And a lot of parents all of a sudden realized, wait a minute, you mean when the you know what hits the fan, when push comes to shove and there's some sort of emergency, my child's education is ultimately on me. It's ultimately on me. Whoa, wait a minute. You guys aren't going to take care of this child and educate this child when it's now hard for you, when there's something going on, when there's an emergency. It actually really does come back to me, doesn't it? And I think that there is aha moments happening with parents all over the country when they're realizing the buck really does stop with me. I think honestly, I'm in a strange way, I'm like stoked about what's going on because I think parents are getting a window into what their children are learning. Parents are beginning to feel re-empowered again of, you know what? Hey, wait a minute. I just had to handle this for the last 3 months. I can handle this. We can handle this if we
And
need.
my child is doing so much better because I keep hearing that from parents that their kids, especially the kids who have these gender confusion issues, so many of them are desisting because they're not going to school.
I think that I would say to parents, listen, recognize that you are an authority. I, be, parents, parents have been having for decades an identity crisis themselves. And that's in part why children are. And I'm calling parents back to yourselves, back to the authority that you have. You alone were the people that either carried this child into the earth, created this child, or perhaps adopted this child, took this child in as your own. And by the way, I'm a parent of both a biological and adopted child. And either way, you love them more than anybody on this planet. You alone would give your life for them. Okay, when emergencies come, teachers will turn them over, but you will do what it takes. So step back into your role as parents, get involved in school, let the school know that things have to go through you in order to and you want to know how my child is being treated, how my child is being named, referred to at school. If you have any questions, I would go into that school and demand to know.
And it is, you're right, and it's more important. I was actually talking to Brenton Netz yesterday, and he was talking about the situation with his child, and he mentioned that even if it means like pretty significant economic hardship in the short term,
Absolutely.
it is worth either homeschooling or having lots of time in the classroom, because you will have such an impact now, and you won't be having to deal with years and years of trying to pick up the pieces of a child who's been damaged.
Well, here's a few more, and that is absolutely correct. Before you get to that point, the other issue is monitor the counselor's office. I actually do not allow I've told my child, you have an issue, you come to me and your dad. We have ministers, we have close dear friends. You can talk to, aunt whatever, and I don't even have to, whatever. But you don't go to the counselor's office because it is no longer a trusted place. It flat out is not. And so I would just tell them, no, you don't go to a counselor. You come to us, we'll get you the help you need if you need help. And I would demand to know, I would go to school, has my child gone to the counselor's office? I want to know, and who is it? And this is what I would say to parents at this point. We're at a place, you asked me how we got here. I'm going to answer that in a minute, but I just so want to make sure that we empower parents. We're at a place that if you have any suspicion that this school is lying to you or doing something that you disapprove of, or you're seeing signs of confusion in your child, you're seeing signs that are disturbing you, you trust your instincts. Trust your instincts. And if the school is not giving you everything that you demand of them, they work for you. You are a taxpayer. And that's the sort of attitude that you should go into their office with. Okay. Attitude has a way of communicating. The expectations that you communicate to others have a way of influencing them. If you go in hat in hand and sort of mealy mouthed, and by the way, I just, can I? No, it's not can I, it's excuse me. Your employer is here. And this is what I demand to know. I have a right to know. And there's no law. It's a perversion of the law. It is not valid to say under state or federal law that they can keep privacy, that a child has privacy rights against their own parents. That is a distortion of the law. You have a right to know. And if they're not doing in any way they're supposed to do, I would, bring pressure to bear. But if not, take your child out of that school and don't wait. Don't wait.
Well, and I think that's such an interesting point you made, because it reminded me of something that happened here in Utah just a couple months ago. there was a yearbook in which someone had, I guess each of the seniors was able to have a senior quote. And one of them quoted that sex is binary and there are a lot of mentally ill people. That was his quote in his yearbook. And somehow it got through. But then when it hit, when somehow somebody discovered it was in all the media outlets, the school hired therapists to work with children who were traumatized
Oh
by
my,
that.
oh
And
my.
I'm thinking, what kind of message are we giving to children? We're telling them that hearing something like that or having something like that in their yearbook is so traumatic that they might have to go to see a mental health professional immediately to get help to stabilize them. I mean, to me, that is just that's a horrifying message, and it's no wonder our kids are so fragile. And these are the messages that they're getting from their schools and their counselors that they can't even handle hearing something that offends them.
Someone said this, I mean, it might have been in one of your interviews. We have people who have gone through war, Holocaust, you know, dogs attacking, them, um, just horrific abuse, and still being able to overcome and be resilient. And yet in this generation, we are inculcating a fragility in our children that is disturbing. It is doing them no good. It's doing them great harm. It is setting them up for failure in life. You asked me, how did we get here? We didn't get here just overnight. It's been several decades of several things happening, and that we as adults and as parents have to just kind of take just a cold, hard look um, at ourselves. But the good thing about that is that if the answer lies in us, then the solution lies in us and we have power over it. Okay. But part of it is that we have increasingly over the last several decades have, number one, allowed the disintegration of our families. Okay. The disintegration of our marriages. And that's not to shame anyone. It's just the reality. Where I see the worst situations, the worst that call our office is where you have two now separated parents and they're now fighting over the child, like Miles's parents. And this warfare is literally, physically tearing this child apart, not even figuratively, literally, right? And so part of it is just the failure to guard that nuclear family. And you know what? At the end of the day, you brought because I'm one of them too. I'm a parent. We brought these children into the world. In a sense, we should make them a solemn promise that we will guard our marriage and our family to be a sacred, safe castle that the enemy cannot breach, and that this child will be safe within these and will be taught rightly, and so forth. But unfortunately, that the castle has been breached, and frankly, we've allowed it. That's one thing, but we can reverse that. That's one how we got there. But number two, we've been increasingly turning decisions over to quote unquote experts. We have allowed the encroachment and a governing by experts, by outside entities, and largely because there has been the disintegration of the nuclear family. So now you need all these other outside entities to step in and to provide the counsel and the guidance and the expertise, the blah, 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 that was once provided by parents, extended family, grandparents, wise uncles and aunts, pastors, spiritual leaders, rabbis, okay, who cared about us and did what was in our best interest. But now we're increasingly turning it over to strangers with an MD or a PhD or LCSW. And unfortunately, the medical community in this area has become politicized. So this is slowly how we got, and the problem is that schools, someone in their defense, have increasingly had to play parent to our children. It's unfortunately, we see an encroachment of increasing measures of socialism coming in through the locus point of public schools. This needs to be arrested. This needs to be stopped, because with these clinics that are coming onto the schools, you have the possibility of decisions being made without parental consent. You have not only in the area of sexuality and STIs and pregnancy, but now with gender identity and with the treatments which are so harmful to children. This is not acceptable. This has got to stop. And I want to reiterate how we get there, because understanding how you get somewhere is the key to understanding how you deconstruct what you have allowed to be built. When parents and families allowed themselves, without perhaps even realizing, to disintegrate, and the sanctity of that marriage and of that home and of that family to be eroded, and now you have these warring factions called parents, schools had to step in. Many times they became places of stability for children caught in the middle of custody battles. They were often witnesses, called as witnesses in custody battles. They became places where children can go and talk, and vent about the strain that they were experiencing at home because of the disintegration of the home. Again, I have no interest in shaming anyone. It's just a reality check for us. And so, almost in their defense, as schools saw themselves becoming surrogate parents for children and buddies and counselors and so forth, it's almost like a switch began to turn. And the problem is that then parents began to see their rights start to be eroded. It's almost as if, well, if we're called on to sort of be surrogate parents, then I guess we're going to start claiming parental authority. And I don't know that there was any single conversation or any agenda per se. It was just sort of an evolution, a devolution, not an evolution, a devolution. That now, at the right time, with opportunistic forces out there, trans activist forces, that now something came into the school where already parents were on their heels. Already parents were sort of, in many ways, supplanted by public schools. And now the activists come in, they want to bring in their agenda. And this is the scenario. So the answer is, you know what, parents, take back that place. Reconstitute your home to the best that you possibly can. If you're divorced, listen, as best as you can, try to get on the same page with with the other parent of your child, so that you become a united front to protect your child from this stuff.
And insist on being in the classroom. I actually had an experience when my son was little. I had one teacher who didn't want parents in the classroom, and that put up red flags for me. And I just started going, and I would just go and sit, and she would just glare at me. But if there's a teacher who isn't wanting parents in the classroom, that's a red flag. Turns out what she was doing is that instead of allowing kids to go to recess, she would have them put their heads on the desk and turn the lights down, because she didn't want to have to go supervise them at recess. So no wonder kids were having some issues in there, because you take a little boy who's 7 or 8 years old and not allow him any recess throughout the day, that kid's gonna have some issues. So really assert yourself. Like you said, you're the boss here. These are your kids, and you get to dictate. And that doesn't mean to overrun the schools, but it means to assert yourself and do what's best for your kids.
Right. And so then if they're simply refusing to work with you, and you're seeing signs, then you take your child out of that school. And it's like your other guest, the father of Miles, was saying, there is no amount of money that you can pay to get back a child once they have started down this confused road. Because children, they latch on this with the passion of youth. And many children who do have other comorbidities, they have other things going on. And so this becomes, in a sense, sort of like a perceived savior to them. And once a child begins to go down this, you have really got a very serious problem. So it is just not worth it. You take this out. And that's what's so beautiful about what we're seeing with COVID right now in a strange, the silver lining is that we've had a few months where we had to figure it out. And you know what? We made it work. So if we have to figure out how to homeschool or find the money for a private school, or you know what, advocate for school choice in your state. There was just a Supreme Court decision about a month ago that declared unconstitutional the Blaine amendments. Those were amendments to many of the state constitutions that disallowed state funds from going to religious private schools. Well, they were declared unconstitutional. So now there's the real possibility of school choice in different states. I'd be out there advocating for that, so that you can take your dollar to follow your child where you feel is best for your child.
And this potentially even advocate for people who homeschool to get those funds.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So they bring in tutors and so forth. So I tell you, so long as there are breath in our lungs as parents, we're not helpless.
Well, thank you so much. I know we are out of time, and there were so many other topics that I wanted to get to. So maybe at some point down the road, I can do this again with you, so you can talk about VCAP, which really quickly is just your efforts and other in your state and other efforts in other states to try and make it illegal to give these kids who are gender confused experimental medical interventions that are harmful in order to treat a mental health issue. And that's
really... touch on that briefly now, or we could do it another time.
If you have time, I would love to talk about it now.
Okay. Yeah, I can take about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Sure. This is really important. It's the model bill is the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, so VCPA. And that was based upon what we helped write in South Dakota. It was defeated by a very narrow margin in South Dakota, really came close. But there are other states who are taking up the battle. And it's basically a piece of legislation, including here in Georgia. It's a piece of legislation that would essentially ban puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and these non-essential surgeries, mastectomies, the sexual surgeries that sterilize children. It would ban them in minors when it's for the purpose of seeking to quote unquote affirm a child in a false sexual identity. We feel very, very strongly that these treatments, number one, they interfere with a child's healthy development. They do not allow a child to go through their healthy and normal puberty. Puberty is an essential puberty is not a disease. Your sex is not a disease. You're not treating any disease state. When you give these treatments, these puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, there's no disease that you're treating, because sex is not a disease.
In fact, you're causing disease.
You actually are causing a disease state. It's called the iatrogenic state. So, but the puberty blockers, they're not allowing children's healthy growth and development to occur. That stunts their growth. It has impacts on the bones, the skeletal system, and it opens them up for all kinds of long-term side effects. And frankly, and many unknown, because they've never been studied. They've never been studied.
Right. This is a completely experimental use. We have no longitudinal studies to show how these kids are going to turn out. But we do know from studies that we've seen that their chances of suicidality are going to go up, that we are basically inducing developmental delays in children. And I can't imagine any other case where people would advocate to cause a child to have a developmental delay.
Absolutely. And people need to understand, and parents do. And I really want to speak to parents who have children who are struggling deeply with gender dysphoria. Chances are you have been misled by some in the medical community. You need to seek other opinions who will give you the full story. If you haven't been told that if you've been told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are entirely reversible, then you have been lied to. And in fact, in England, where they have a lot of experience in this, and it's a very liberal, progressive society, they are considering banning these treatments in in minors, and they have removed the statement that puberty blockers are reversible. They no longer will make that statement because they're not.
Yeah, they're not.
When puberty is an important time for your brain to develop, there's certain parts of your brain that require those hormones to be involved. So you're impacting the healthy brain development of your child in ways that we don't even know. We don't even know. So number one. Number two, when you institute puberty blockers at a young age and then follow with cross-sex hormones, you chemically sterilize a child. This is, in my opinion, as a lawyer, this is like something out of Nuremberg. It is the height of unethical. It is in my mind, if a government agency is involved, it's unconstitutional, because you're depriving children of a healthy and an important function, human function, a fundamental human function, while they're incompetent. They're children. They have no concept of what it's going to mean to someday have children of their own. Most children don't want to have children. They find it icky. I don't want to, most teenagers, I don't have a child. Of course you don't. You're not intended to at that time. You have no idea what you're going to feel like when you're 30. And all of a sudden, different parts of you start to kick in. And then, but you've been deprived of that right.
Yeah, it's eugenics. I mean, it really is. It's a situation where we're sterilizing children who have mental health issues. And
Yes.
the fact that so many of them have autism, to me, this is so nefarious. I mean, this really is so profoundly unethical. It's hard for me to even imagine how doctors can justify it. But often these doctors just have no, they're doctors often who don't have children themselves and have no sense of the sanctity and beauty and wonder of being a parent, and to deprive a child of that. I mean, I remember very clearly asking my doctor in high school to sterilize me because I did not like children. And I look back on it now, and my children have been the biggest blessing in my life. I mean, I can't imagine if I had been deprived of that, and how much that would have just sort of stifled me,
Right.
as a human being. And there are all these other cases where, they illegally sterilized women in third world countries, or they illegally sterilized people with developmental disabilities, or they illegally sterilized, some other marginalized group, and people get up in arms. But now we have the same people who are advocating sterilizing these children, and it makes no sense.
Well, the justification is because, in many cases, is because the child wants it. Or this perception, and many parents are told, if you don't do this, your child is going to commit suicide.
Right. And
on both of those counts, I say, shame on you, professionals. Shame on you for making those statements. Number one, as far as parents, again, I hope that these words are empowering you to take back your authority if you have a gender confused child, and get a second or third or fourth opinion, because there are no valid studies that are showing that these treatments actually reduce suicide in children. Certainly no long-term studies, and the only long-term studies we have actually show a much higher rate of suicide in patients that have undergone these treatments. There's really, they have no valid evidence to be making these claims. But on the other hand, these children so often have other things going on with them psychologically. Oftentimes there's trauma. For many girls, they have either intuned from society, or from watching domestic violence in their own home, or themselves being molested when they were young, or raped, or whatever the case may be, or knowing someone that has. For all these reasons, they have intuned that to be a girl is to be vulnerable, is to be weak, is to be hunted, is to be for prey. And so you have to get underneath and understand, why is it that this child is rejecting their body with such ferocity? What is beneath here? And so many times you'll see this other comorbidities.
And once again, we're saying, well, the child wants it, we give it to them. And that's not how it works. If a child walked into a doctor's office and requested any number of treatments or prescriptions or interventions, the doctor would say no. But in this case, we're supposed to do what the child wants because the child wants it. And it really is confounding to me.
That's where the adults have to be adults and recognize a child, particularly a psychologically compromised child, not just any child, but even more so, a psychologically compromised child in one way or the other, whether it's autism or trauma or chronic depression or, a variety of things. The last thing you want to do is to give that person what they're demanding. Very oftentimes it's the very thing that you give a drug addict the drug of their choice? Do you give a girl with bulimia or anorexia, a plan for calorie reduction? I mean, you get to the underlying. Here's what's so tragic about it, Erin. You know this is when you treat someone with a methodology that actually doesn't get at the causation, you actually harm them because you're leaving them with the very things that are causing their suffering. You're leaving them in that state. And it's worse when you actually tell them that some placebo you're giving them, something else, is going to be their salvation. And it's not. You've lied to them. And so there may be a brief euphoric effect. It's a placebo effect. We know there's at least a 25 to 40% placebo effect. If you give someone sugar, they'll feel better. If they're
Well, and in this case, you're giving them hormones, which
yeah,
pumps up their
exactly.
system. I mean,
Right. So there's a brief euphoric effect, but over time, it will not get to the ultimate causation. And so parents, you are not doing your child good. And it is a threat that is not backed up by well done, placebo-controlled studies and science to say that they're going to commit suicide. The opposite, frankly, it's the opposite that's more likely. If they go down this road over time, you're failing to treat what is their true causes of their dysphoria. And over time, they will only be more depressed.
especially when they have healthcare providers and teachers and potentially parents telling them that they're inherently flawed. And the only way to cure them is to make these cosmetic changes. What a bizarre thing to tell a kid. I mean, I can't imagine how a child processes something like that because it's just such a bizarre message, and it really is reinforcing all the all the self-hatred that a child has. And it's like medicalized self-harm. You've got a child who is really uncomfortable with themselves. They go to the doctor and the doctor basically validates them and says, all right, I'm going to actually help you harm yourself.
Erin, I'll close with this thought as we sort of wind down, and we will come back some other day and we'll talk about the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, which we're almost certainly going to reintroduce here in Georgia and probably several other states around the country. So important, because that will then empower parents who don't even want their child to have the option of going down this. It will kind of fortify them. We as parents and our organization as a group of lawyers want to be able to back you up in saying this. Many times the most loving, most merciful, the kindest thing that we can say to our child is no, for something that they think that they desperately want. But out of my love for you and out of the wisdom that I have for being an adult, from life experience, from doing the research, from talking to a wide variety of sources, many times the kindest thing we can say to our child, the most loving, is to say no. And we seem to have lost temporarily, I believe we're getting it back, the ability to do that in white middle class, upper middle class America. But I think we're beginning to see the devastation that it is doing in our child's lives, and then some young adults that have been through this and are beginning to recognize it. And I would just say, if your child came to you and said, I don't want to go to school anymore, I just did not, and they're 8 years old, you say, no, you're going to school. Your child, I don't want to go to bed, I just want to be up all night, you say no. You have your teenager come to you, hey, I want this opioid, or I want the meth, it's going to make me happy. You say, no. So if it's not, you cannot appreciate that in those, this is the same thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vernadette. I really appreciate your sharing your expertise on these issues and all the work that you're doing. It's just so important. And I'm so thankful that you are out there advocating for these kids and for parents. I mean, really for society.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. It's what we're called to do. So, Erin, I look forward to talking with you again and working with you. And I
Thank you
thank you
so
for
much.
what you're doing.
Thank you.